I'm going to be going over the November 3rd Sunday school lesson because I think it's an exceptionally difficult passage, and they have assigned an especially long number of paragraphs or chapters. So I don't think there's any chance that we will get all the way through it. And I think the material is important, so I want to be able to provide something which helps you to go through the material and to come to a conclusion at the end. So the lesson begins in Romans chapter 9, and it is primarily Paul trying to explain what in the world has happened with the Jews because they were God's chosen people and they have fallen away. And does that reflect badly on God's justice? How is it that they're to be restored? And that sort of thing. The Israelites, if you recall, had been God's people in Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9. We see them being adopted by God as his people. We have Abraham's calling in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. We have the Exodus from Egypt, Exodus 3, 10 through 12. And we have the journey into the promised land with Joshua, Deuteronomy 31, 7 through 8. So we see that God has reached into the history of Israel and brought them as his people through thousands of years of relationship. But now, in front of Paul's eyes, the Jews are beginning to fall away from God. So that brings up the question, if God has promised to bless Israel, why have so many Israelites rejected Jesus? So this brings up other questions that are evident in the text. What does Paul mean when he's talking about God's sovereign choices? What do we think about God's character if he is choosing people and rejecting other people? And how does the example given of Isaac and Jacob illustrate God's faithfulness? So we want to take a look at God's promises and his sovereignty, explaining that not all who have descended from Israel are true Israelites. God's selection of people are people of the promise, and it is by the Spirit and not necessarily by the flesh. One of the primary questions in this is God unjust? And this section, Romans 9, 14 through 29, addresses concerns about God making sovereign choices. Paul quotes Moses, or quotes God saying, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. And then he uses an example of the potter and the clay to illustrate God's authority. And that raises some questions because these verses have been translated or understood in a number of different ways. The first way that people have thought about these verses is Calvinism, which is focused on God's sovereignty and the idea that God chooses people both for salvation and for damnation. And we'd have to ask ourselves whether these verses reinforce that. And the answer is no, they do not, because these sections, the potter and the clay and the rest of it, are addressed to the nation of Israel. The context does not demonstrate that these are God's choices in regard to individuals, but they are how he has addressed his people, that is, the people of Israel. The second is Arminianism, and that is that everybody has free will and the ability to make a choice. And that also is a theology that has some difficulties, although it's perhaps more palatable than Calvinism. A third choice is what's called Molinism, which means that God has honored both the free will of people and his own sovereignty. And basically the way that that works is that God knows what every person will do in every circumstance, and he also knows what he wishes to accomplish as he is um, working through time. So he takes people and he places them in the places where they need to be in order that his will might be done. And each person who is acting according to their own free will. So they aren't coerced, they aren't made to do anything, yet their decisions will reinforce what God has done because in his foreknowledge, he has put them in the places where they will do what needs to happen. So those are the theological questions or answers that rise out of all of that. The primary issue is what in the world happened? Why did Israel stumble? And Paul tells us it's because they pursued righteousness through the law rather than righteousness through faith. And earlier in the book of Romans, he's talked about Abraham and faith. So the question is, how are we saved? So if we look at 1 Corinthians 9, 19 to 23, John 3, 16 to 18, 2 Peter 3:9, we see that people are saved by having faith in Jesus. And that is where the Jews went wrong. They had an understanding that by obeying the law, they were determining their eternal destiny, and they didn't see it in terms of faith. It was a checklist of sorts. So we see Paul coming to the conclusion that the reason that they fell away was because they didn't understand the need for a relationship with Jesus. In the beginning of 11, we see Paul addressing the question of whether or not God has rejected his people. And we see that he has saved a remnant, that he has chosen a portion of those people and has saved them through grace. So God's faithfulness is demonstrated through his grace and his preservation of those who have come to faith in him. In Romans 11 through 24, we see that there is going to be a rejection of the nation of Israel as a whole. Yet Paul explains that that rejection is not entirely negative because in that rejection, the Gentiles are going to be given an opportunity to come to Jesus through faith. There's an example of the Gentiles being grafted into the olive tree that is Israel. And Paul, of course, warns the Gentiles that if the Jewish people had fallen away, how much more careful that they need to be. So there's an emphasis on the unity of the Jews and the Gentiles in God's plan. In Romans 11, 25 through 27, Paul reveals a mystery about Israel's hardening, and he notes that it's partial and it's temporary, lasting until the fullness of the Gentiles come in, after which all of Israel will be saved. This particular verse, or these few verses, have sparked a number of interpretations. One of the interpretations has been that there are two paths. We have the path of the Christian community and we have the path of the Jewish people, and those paths run parallel. The problem with this is that it avoids or it ignores a number of scriptures that indicate that salvation comes through Christ, and Jesus' name is the only name by which we must be saved. So that sheds or casts some question on that particular understanding. Then there's replacement theology, which is simply claiming that the church has become Israel, and therefore the nation of Israel and the Jews have very little to do with the kingdom of God, other than those Jews who happen to become Christians. And that also seems to struggle a bit for fitting all of the scriptures. There is a third option that is inclusion theology, which best fits Paul's metaphor of the olive tree. And it says, in essence, that the people of God are made up from Israelites who have believed in Jesus and Gentiles who have come together to have faith in Jesus, making up one large multi-ethnic family of believers. So this view upholds the integrity of God's covenant and connects all believers through Christ. It also goes on to say all Israel will be saved. So that should give us some assurance that all those who have come to faith in Jesus Christ will find salvation. In conclusion, we want to be thinking a little bit about God's character and his redemptive plan for humanity. How can we trust God more deeply in our lives, knowing that he keeps his promises? In the discussion about God's sovereignty and mercy, we need to be thinking about how that impacts our lives and how we interact with others. We are to live out our lives through faith, both with words and deeds, recognizing the unity and inclusivity of God's redemptive plan. So that brings us to the end of our very brief summary of this passage, and hopefully that will put everything into context and allow you to make sense of those passages. Have a great morning or day, afternoon.